Raphael Woolf did his MPhil and his PhD here at King's. And after that, had a bit of a bumpy career where he had first become assistant and then associate professor at Harvard University before finally taking the step up back to becoming staff member here at King's in 2006. Where I think then I was his colleague, I think around 2007, we've been colleagues for about 17 years or something, and until last year. And now April is honorary emeritus professor here and an honorary professor at the Keeling Institute and some other institution, UCL, I think it's a football league, but some other institution. And I know Raphael very well and benefited from his insights into philosophy over the years. You might know that he is a translator, co-translator into Dianetics, translator of Cicero's Dialogos, has written an excellent monograph on the Carnides, which you heard an awful lot about, as well as a work on Cicero and his philosopher. His work, he's always been a colleague, and we very much look forward to hearing him speak today on a suitably provocative title.
Well, thank you. Have we done the handout? Because yeah, great. Everyone's got one. Fantastic. It sounds like my voice is more or less carrying. That's great. All I need now is my talk. So bear with me. It's very nice to be here, and thanks very much, John, for that intro, and John and Zita and Sue and everybody who's organised this terrific event. Very, very nice to be back on what will always be home territory, as far as I'm concerned. All right. I'm going to start, indeed, by saying a little bit about my the provocative first half of my title, and I hope you found it provocative. That's why you're all here, right? And it is supposed to be a provocation, but I'm going to, sort of in classic philosophical style, I'm going to move straight to a qualification that may initially seem like an outright contradiction, but isn't really. So, of course, I think the dialogue form matters. I mean, it's one of the great joys of reading Plato that he writes in that way, and does so with a level of brilliance that remains, certainly within the philosophical canon, I would say, unsurpassed. Plato without the dialogue form is as unimaginable as Petrarch without the sonnet form. One for the kids there. Nothing I'm going to say will change or is intended to change any of that. Okay. Nonetheless, there is an important respect in which, so I shall argue, the dialogue form has been given more importance than it deserves. And that is with regard to a familiar and long-standing debate about how to read Plato. The debate has its roots in antiquity, and given its longevity, I won't pretend that what I have to say here is especially new. Long debate. I hope that what follows, though, might nonetheless show there's still a bit of room for some reorientation. So although I call this a debate, one of its frustrating features is that the antagonists have a kind of tendency to talk past each other, as often happens in philosophical debates, by each emphasizing a different aspect of the way that Plato uses the dialogue form. So part of my specific task here will be to try to persuade you that the terms of the debate have been unhelpfully distorted by the prominence given to the dialogue form within it, and that an alternative approach can shed light both on the debate and on the nature of Plato's works as written texts. So the debate is about the extent to which we can read off Plato's views from his works. And as I've indicated, it has tended to allot an important place to the work's dialogue form, with each side highlighting different aspects of it. So those who defend the position that you can read off Plato's views pretty much directly emphasize that in each dialogue there is generally a leading, indeed a dominant character. Socrates in most dialogues, a handful of others in some others. who must surely therefore be Plato's representative in that work, and to whom we are therefore justified in attributing something like Plato's views at the time of writing the work. Now, the notion that we can identify a leading character in each work is not entirely straightforward. Most of the dialogues that feature Socrates are named after a participating character who is not Socrates. And we know that the titles of some of the dialogues are quite ancient. So Aristotle, for example, refers to the Meno. Perhaps the titular character should therefore be regarded as the leading one. Titles aside, it's in any event not always obvious which, if any, character should be identified as the leading one in a given work. One could, for instance, make a pretty good case that Protagoras, rather than Socrates, is the leading character in the Protagoras, and nobody, as far as I'm aware, claims him as Plato's representative. A different kind of example is the Symposium, which consists mainly in a series of set speeches, with Socrates' contribution, formally just one amongst many, with the role of his narrated authority figure Diotima also to consider, and with Alcibiades making a disruptively memorable, lengthy speaking appearance at a climactic point in the work. Moreover, the dialogue in which a single character is most dominant is the Apology, given that it is mainly a continuous speech without a preamble. But the Apology purports in a special way to be biographical, insofar as it depicts, albeit with creative license, an episode from Socrates' life that is also a known historical event, his defense speech at his trial. This setup makes it hard to see Socrates taking the role of Plato's representative in that work, especially if one notes that it is the only Platonic work in which Plato is said within the drama to be in attendance and is thus presented as a character distinct from Socrates. Slightly different case is the Phaedo, where Plato famously has himself reported as absent through illness from Socrates' final day, and they're the only two works where Plato gets so much as a mention. Okay, with these provisos in hand, turn to the other side of the debate, where those who deny that you can straightforwardly read off Plato's views from his dialogues often appeal to the, as it were, dialogical character of the dialogues. Plato gives us conversations, written in most, if not all, of his works with great vividness. It cannot therefore be right to isolate, so the view goes, to isolate one participant in a conversation and identify them as the representative of Plato in a particular work. One might add that in many of the dialogues we do get real debates between different points of view, most fiercely perhaps in the Gorgias, but by no means only in that work. If Plato had meant his own view to be straightforwardly identifiable, then in composing dialogues of this type, he has chosen an odd way of going about it. The problem, however, is that both sides seem to have a point concerning Plato's use of the dialogue form. On the one hand, the dialogues are very often highly dialogical. On the other hand, they generally have a character, in most but not all cases Socrates, who can be identified as dominant in terms of guiding the discussion, putting forth arguments, and so on. Indeed, for those of us who, like me, want to defend the idea that one cannot straightforwardly read off Plato's views from what his characters say, the worry is that despite the provisos noted above, the opponents of this idea seem to be onto something. It is all very well for defenders to speak of the dialogues as encompassing multiple voices and therefore multiple points of view, but if they also generally have one identifiable leading character, then it seems we can't really speak of being presented with, as it were, a level playing field of voices. One of the voices usually does dominate in a given work. So if the multivocality of dialogue is offered as grounds for denying that one can straightforwardly read off Plato's views from the dialogues, the opponent can retort that that is a shaky basis for denial, since it fails to account for how prevalent the phenomenon of dominance is. Well, that's not to deny that certain features of the way particularly Socrates as main speaker is presented, for example, the dialectical and often aporetic character of his arguments, may make attributing views to him as a character itself problematic. But this still allows the opponent to maintain that to the extent that a given character's views are identifiable, we should take those of the dominant character to be Plato's, and that glossing views suitably broadly to include, say, methods and outlooks, it is those belonging to the leading character that should likewise be taken as recipient of Platonic endorsement. I'll turn later to what I regard as a sounder basis for meeting the opponent. But let me first elaborate a little on the interpretive position I am trying to oppose. I described it above as one that takes the leading character in a given work to be the representative of Plato's views. And it may be thought there is something a little vague about the notion of representing. So let me put my cards on the table and somewhat more specifically say that I have in mind here a position that takes it as legitimate to straightforwardly identify Plato's views with those of his leading character in a given work. Now, the reason I've been a bit hesitant to come clean in this way about the opposition position is that this so-called mouthpiece view, I'm sure some of you have heard of it, of the relation between Plato and in particular his character Socrates, the latter the mouthpiece of the former, is quite hard, though by no means impossible, to find explicitly propounded, at least in more recent scholarly literature. But from this relative infrequency of expression, I think the wrong inference to draw is that few any longer sign up to the view. Rather, I think the right explanation is virtually the opposite, that it remains quite legitimate as a matter of the academic sociology of Platonic scholarship, at least in the Anglophone sphere, to proceed on the basis of an identity between Plato and a given leading character. It remains, for example, judging by the number of cases one continues to see in the literature regarding a phrase such as blank says or blank argues, unobjectionable to use Socrates, or where appropriate Timaeus, or the stranger, and Plato interchangeably to fill in the blank in discussions of Plato's work. The reason that the mouthpiece view does not receive much current articulation is not because it is now beyond the pale, but because it remains a sufficiently common and acceptable approach to reading Plato not to require articulate defense. What Christopher Gill wrote about the view in 2006, and have a look at T1 on the handout, thus seems to me still largely to hold good. And I'll just read a little extract from T1, quote, so widespread and unself-conscious that it may escape notice as a distinct mode of interpretation at all, though it is one, close quote. But it's perhaps illustrative of the entrenched nature of the positions on either side and their mutual lack of engagement that 10 years earlier, Malcolm Schofield was able to describe as, this is T2 on the handout, describe it as by now commonplace, the view, and here's T2, that, quote, a Platonic dialogue is the dramatic representation of a conversation between interlocutors, none of whom can be assumed to be merely spokesmen for Plato's own views any more than in any other form of drama. In any event, as I hinted above, there are some notable cases in our current century where the mouthpiece view is overtly propounded. And I'm going to offer two examples. The first, very recent, to illustrate that advocacy of the view remains a live option on the menu of Platonic interpretation. And the second, very striking, in what it shows about how the view can exert its grip. The first example, then, is from the editorial introduction by Larson and Politis to Routledge's 2025 companion to Plato, The Platonic Mind. And this is T3 on the handout, which I will read, quote, it is our view that Socrates is more than an influence on Plato's thought, for he is not merely Plato's teacher, he is also the mouthpiece that Plato uses in most of his dialogues to conduct his inquiries, and to express his philosophy in the distinctive way he does. Socrates' convictions, his arguments, and his attitudes toward his city and his fellow citizens are, in many ways, Plato's own." Close quote. Notwithstanding the prudent qualification "in many ways" and the specific application to Socrates, this is a pretty full-throated and explicit statement of the mouthpiece view. Though how we are in a position to ascertain, without begging the question at hand, what Plato's attitudes and convictions are, such that Socrates can be seen to be expressing them, is not explained. The mouthpiece view is one, I have a chapter in that very volume, which is why I'm kind of interested in it. The mouthpiece view is one I implicitly take issue with at the close of my own chapter in the volume. The editors were absolutely generous, didn't try to impose any interpretive straitjacket on individual contributors, but the sort of net effect is presentation of the mouthpiece view as a position that it is legitimate to assert, with little or no defence, as at least one valid option among others. So that's my first example. My second, slightly older example of the view's persistence comes from David Sedley's 2004 monograph on the Theaetetus, the midwife of Platonism. Sedley doesn't use the term mouthpiece, but his description of his preferred approach shows that this is what he has in mind. And this is T4 on the handout. So, quote, "In general, I favour the view that by and large, the main speaker in a dialogue can be assumed to be voicing Plato's own beliefs and arguments. However, that assumption does not preclude the occasional presence of a contrived gap between author and speaker in cases where the gap may actually serve a purpose. The default assumption, in other words, remains that of author-speaker identity. But this identity can be set aside in cases where good reasons emerge for separating the two. My contention is that the Theaetetus is one such case." Close quote. Well, I'd like to draw attention to two features of this quote. The first is the rather grudging nature of the concession that an occasional contrived gap may be posited between Plato as author and his main speaker. This seems to sit uncomfortably with Sedley's own interpretive procedure. If incorporating non-identity in the case of one dialogue, namely the Theaetetus, can produce, as Sedley must suppose, fruitful results, then it is unclear to me why he should take us to be restricted only to occasional further forays with this approach, and why any reason for favouring it is needed beyond the fact that none of Plato's main characters is Plato. Sedley's stance has the implication that while non-identity does important work in the Theaetetus, it generally does not do so elsewhere in the Platonic corpus. As far as I can see, Sedley gives no grounds for supposing that this is true, especially as the Theaetetus has no unique claim in the corpus to separation of author from main character. This brings me to the second striking feature of Sedley's discussion, namely his claim that the default interpretive position should be author-speaker identity. That seems to me simply untrue to the structure of the Platonic works as we have them, indeed to get things exactly backwards. We are given non-identity between author and speaker as a basic feature of the corpus. There is no character Plato in a speaking role anywhere therein. The default relation between author and main speaker is therefore non-identity, and reasons need to be given for failing to respect it. Well, these two examples indicate in their different ways that the mouthpiece view remains alive, if not, as far as I can see, in particularly robust health. Yet the very absence in both examples of good reason given for upholding it shows the view's tenacity as an acceptable interpretive option. Our discussion of Sedley, at any rate, suggests an approach to critiquing the view that revolves around non-identity of author and main speaker in Plato, rather than appeal to the dialogue form as such. Before turning to that, I want to motivate pushback against this view by drawing attention to two peculiarities inherent to it. So, why don't I like the view that I'm trying to oppose? First peculiarity about straightforwardly identifying Plato as author with his leading character on a given occasion is its sheer anomalousness. You'd be laughed out of court for doing this in pretty much any other case of interpreting the relation between author and character. Surely not even the most naive undergraduate would write about, say, Macbeth or Lear, however dominant those characters may be in their respective works, and feel they could without qualm identify what either of them says with Shakespeare's own views. Now, there is, as it happens, a subgenre of Platonic interpretation, one that includes excellent scholars such as Berniat, Irwin, and Kraut, who concede that this is true about Shakespeare, but go on to say that in various ways it's different with Plato, for reasons I find unconvincing, but I won't, at least in this part, in the talk part, I won't go into here. I have talked about it a little bit elsewhere, as they say. It may, however, be significant that the applicability to Plato of the comparison with Shakespeare is asserted, with specific reference to Macbeth, by Leo Strauss in City and Man, and critiqued by Berniat in his influential broadside against Strauss and the Straussians, Sphinx Without a Secret from 1985. If you haven't read it, it's marvelous entertainment at the very least. Sphinx Without a Secret is then referenced by Kraut as part of an effort to leave room for the mouthpiece view in his introductory chapter to the first edition from 1992 of the Cambridge Companion to Plato, thence no doubt to be read by interested undergraduates, naive or otherwise. Well, Berniat's article, I think it fair to suggest, helped make it legitimate, if not mandatory in some quarters, not simply to neglect what Strauss or Straussians had to say about reading Plato, but to treat the contrary as the obviously sensible position. And so, for reasons not unconnected with the permission thereby granted to ignore the Straussian ghost at the feast, it has remained acceptable to identify Plato with Socrates or Timaeus or the Eleatic Visitor, as the case may be, and just get on and discuss Plato's views in that light, without having to be too concerned about the grounds for attributing them. And this despite the fact that the only Platonic work that leaves open so much as the possibility of its leading character being identifiable as Plato is the Laws, with its unnamed Athenian, though even here, Plato chooses not to identify that character as himself. So the second peculiarity of the mouthpiece view is the implication it has for a specific aspect of Plato's relationship with, in particular, his character Socrates, one that concerns the contrast between the written and the oral. Now, as already mentioned, the problem with the mouthpiece view is not that it is in denial about Plato's dialogues being dialogues. Indeed, in the following sort of way, the view can take the dialogue form quite seriously. Socrates is shown practicing oral dialogue with his interlocutors, and at times, for example in the Apology, advocating its practice. So Plato, to whom identification with Socrates' outlook is on this view to be attributed, is promoting oral dialogue as the proper way to do philosophy. If such promotion is Plato's aim, one has to say again that he's chosen an odd way of going about it, composing an unprecedented series of rich, subtle, beautifully crafted written works in order to show that orality is the way to proceed. Now, part of the reason why this sort of attribution to Plato is by no means confined to proponents of the mouthpiece view is, ironically, Plato's own special excellence as a writer. His dramatic genius creates a kind of transparency effect, transporting us to the scenes he depicts and making us feel as if we're virtually present at those conversations. If so, a reality check is in order. There are no conversations, just written words by a single and singular author. Proponents of the dialogue form's multivocality may at this point happily join their opponents in celebrating Plato as a champion of oral dialogue. But that seems to me a mistake, at least without an assumption that representation of the practice of oral dialogue, however vividly and skillfully executed, is itself evidence that the author is an advocate of the practice represented, as opposed to, say, someone who, as a writer, is in ongoing critical engagement with that practice. What then is the mistake? It's one I've already touched upon. The mistake not of missing the fact that Plato writes dialogues, but of not taking seriously the separation of author from characters. To see that this, not the dialogue form, is the nub of the issue when it comes to the question of how we identify Plato's views, consider on the one hand that the phenomenon of separation would remain just as real if we had no dialogues from Plato, but instead a series of works in which a character distinct from Plato, say Socrates, gave monologues. As we've seen, the Apology, in which Socrates mostly does deliver a monologue, is the nearest thing we have to this. And even advocates of the mouthpiece view tend not to hold it up as a prime exhibit for that view, partly because, as mentioned above, the Apology takes the trouble to present Socrates and Plato as distinct. If then all of Plato's works had consisted of monologues by, say, the character Socrates, the question of whether we could identify the views of the character with those of the author would remain in principle quite open. I take it that in general, no one sees an author's use of a recurring lead character as itself evidence that that character represents their author's view. The kind of superdominance of a character that this hypothetical corpus of Platonic monologues would entail still does not deliver us a mouthpiece. On the other hand, appeal to the dialogue form by opponents of the mouthpiece view would lose force if Plato had still written dialogues, but ones whose main character were Plato himself, stepping out of the shadows of the Apology and Phaedo and taking the lead role in guiding the discussion, putting forward and generally winning the argument, and so on. On this side of the debate too, then, invoking the dialogue form does not get to the heart of the issue. Now, even in this sort of imagined corpus, things are not so straightforward. Compare the actual case of the second best composer of philosophical dialogues in Greco-Roman antiquity, namely Cicero, and his subtle use of the distinction between Cicero the author and the character Cicero, who sometimes features in those works. Despite this proviso, it seems to me that there would have been less debate about whether we should identify Plato's views with those of his leading character if Plato's leading character had been Plato. Such, so to speak, merely formal separation of leading character from author in the dialogues would not have rendered the mouthpiece view immune from question, but it would considerably strengthen its prima facie plausibility regardless of the presence of other characters in the work. It is then not dialogue form, but separation, in the sense of Plato never featuring as a leading character in his own works, that renders the mouthpiece view construed as the thesis that one can read off Plato's views more or less directly from what the leading character in a given work says, inapplicable. For avoidance of doubt, the claim is not that we are ultimately forbidden from identifying the views of Plato with those of Socrates or other of his leading characters. It is that their being his leading characters does not entitle us to read off Plato's views from theirs. The task of discovering what Plato thought from what his characters say will thus be a matter of, if it wasn't already, of hard interpretive work. Despite this, what separation points to is something fundamentally simple: the anchoring of the Platonic works in a basic and incontestable structural feature common to all. Author formally distinct from a group of characters none of whom, at least in a speaking role, are identified as Plato. We can, of course, choose in reading the dialogues not to use them as a basis for trying to figure out what Plato thought. We can, to adapt Sarah Brodie's phrase, do philosophy with Plato, whereby we find in the dialogue some interesting ideas and arguments and use these as a stimulus to our own thinking. But if we want to do something that can be described as interpreting Plato, and I take it that as historians of philosophy, this is something we do want to do, then it seems to me we haven't even begun to do that unless we take separation seriously. So to continue the theme of simplicity, this approach to reading Plato, while adding, in one obvious sense, an extra layer, can on occasion simplify things by undercutting an appearance of paradox that failure to acknowledge separation of author from character might engender. Now here I have in mind especially Socrates' notoriously disparaging remarks about writing in Plato's Phaedrus. And here, for those, certainly some of you, who know how intellectually indebted I am to M.M. McCabe, a little matricide is in order in relation to a paper, Paradox in Plato's Phaedrus, that M.M. published in 1982 as M.M. Mackenzie. The focus of the paper is on the purported paradox of Socrates being made to critique writing in a written work. It contains a great deal of insight about the relation between paradox in Plato and his use of the written word. Nonetheless, I want to take issue with the paper's core claim and say Socrates' discussion of writing in the Phaedrus is not paradoxical. I want to briefly make a general point here about author-character separation before returning to the specific issue of writing and the Phaedrus. In general, there's nothing paradoxical in having a character, including a leading character, in a written work, express sentiments which we have reason to believe are at odds with those of the author. I take this to be an entirely uncontroversial point that only seems to become a matter of contention when Plato is the author under discussion. There is no inherent paradox, for example, in the phenomenon of a known pacifist author writing a dramatic work that features a warmonger as its leading character. Nor, I take it, if this feature were read as, say, an expose of warmongering, would it be reasonable to treat such a reading as an object of suspicion because it makes the author, to paraphrase Berniat's, I think, very strange critique of Strauss, mean the opposite of what their leading character says? We are, in general, as we should be, quite open to the possibility that the meaning an author conveys may be quite different from, even diametrically opposed to, what is expressed by their leading character, and that authors may have any number of motives for depicting characters in that way. To return now to Plato and the specific case of the Phaedrus, we should correspondingly be open to the possibility that the author at least has a different view to convey, not now of war, but of the written word, from that espoused by his leading character. One might argue that the Phaedrus example is resistant to such a move because, unlike the case of the pacifist author, here we have form, a written work, and content, a critique of writing, directly at odds. Let me cite one way in which M.M. characterizes the purported paradox. So this is T5 on the handout. Quote, "Here is Plato writing a book which repudiates the writing of books, a full-blooded antinomy. Socrates says, no logos has ever been written, whether in verse or in prose, which is worthy of great attention. Socrates says it, but Plato writes it. If he writes to convince, he writes that writing should not convince us. If what he writes does convince us, it convinces us that it should not convince us." Close quote. Well, Grant for the sake of argument that Socrates, a character in a book, expresses a view that amounts to the repudiation of the writing of books. Grant, too, that within the drama, Socrates aims to convince his interlocutor of his view. Why should we think that Plato, in any sense that would be troubling, is writing this passage to convince, as opposed to, say, presenting a view for our critical appraisal? Imputing to Plato the aim of convincing seems to rest on the assumption that whatever view is advocated by a character, or perhaps a leading character in a written work, is to be taken as advocated by its author. That is the assumption that generates the appearance of paradox here. Now, of course, I don't wish to deny that Plato may have intended this, I'm sure he did intend this, to be struck by a character in a written work, disparaging written works, and to reflect on that. But the layered structure of the work diffuses any paradoxical clash between form and content. Given that the words in question are represented as spoken by a character who is not identified with the work's author, we are entitled to allow that the author may be critically distanced from the character's words, rather than assume that the authorial purpose is to convince us of their truth. Once we do allow this, our focus might change to investigating, for example, what shortcomings there may be in Socrates' view of writing, guided perhaps by the example of the written work in which they are embedded, to which the character Socrates, of course, has no access, rather than see a paradox that demands unpacking. Well, this is not the place, even regarding the Phaedrus, much as I'd like to engage in detailed readings of Plato, to illustrate an interpretive approach that takes as essential the separation of author from character, and hence the possibility of critical distance between the two. In lieu of that, I'd like at least to suggest, returning to an earlier theme, that some skepticism might be in order when it comes to the idea that Socrates' practice, as represented in the dialogues, is the subject of more or less unqualified authorial approval. In some notable cases, Socrates is presented by Plato as, at the date at which the respective works are set, the dramatic date, associating with young or youngish figures of great promise, think of Alcibiades and Charmides in particular, whose historical counterparts were later to meet, and at the time of the dialogue's composition had met, with disaster. Here there seem reasonable grounds for suspicion that Plato may by this device be signalling that he did not necessarily regard the exposure of such figures to Socrates as an unalloyed good. It is also, in a rather larger number of cases in the dialogues, unclear that Socrates, even if not doing actual harm, has any great positive effect on his interlocutors. Euthyphro, Hippias, and Ion come to mind as perhaps the most egregious examples of this. Now, one way in which the scholarly narrative of a Plato largely uncritical of Socrates might be maintained in the face of this is to concede the phenomenon. Sure, Socrates is portrayed as apparently not doing much good with various of his interlocutors, and is additionally shown as closely associated with some figures who turned out badly. But that's not Socrates' fault. It's the fault of those interlocutors who didn't recognize the worth of his procedure, or who lacked the character and/or intellect to benefit from it. This approach strikes me as implausible. It involves having Plato simultaneously promote the unqualified excellence of Socrates' practice, while illustrating in a variety of concrete encounters its lack of success. And that seems to me an incongruous and therefore uncharitable strategy to impute to Plato. Moreover, the idea that Socrates' interlocutors are to be picked on as the problem has to reckon with the trenchant deconstruction of this stance that Alexander Nehamas has laid out in his wonderful, again, must-read chapter called Platonic Irony, where we, Plato's readers, are rendered self-deceiving connivers at gratuitous portrayals of interlocutors' failings. So stupidity, in the case that Nehamas focuses on, of Euthyphro. If you find yourself saying how stupid you are, Euthyphro, you're in the trap. Right? If we leave aside, as I think we should, the obtuse interlocutor approach, let me consider two alternative ways of upholding Plato as an essentially uncritical devotee of his Socrates. And here I focus on Socratic interlocutors who ostensibly met with later ignominy. The first way is to argue that Socrates isn't, after all, presented by Plato as that closely associated with these interlocutors. The second, that the dialogues do not represent them as having turned out discreditably. In the first case, if the associations in question were relatively fleeting, all we should say is that Socrates never got a chance to be a proper influence on those characters for good or ill. In the second case, the question doesn't arise for Plato of a relation between exposure to Socrates and a discreditable fate. I want to discuss in reverse order an example of each of these approaches, both essayed by Terry Irwin in his review article of Rutherford's very nice book, The Art of Plato. The first concerns Alcibiades. So Irwin questions not the closeness of Alcibiades' depicted association with Socrates, but the idea that Alcibiades is represented as having turned out badly. I mean, whatever the historical truth may be. Irwin cites as evidence against this idea Socrates' claim, and this is T6 on the handout from Plato's Gorgias, that Callicles and Alcibiades will be blamed by the Athenian demos for Athens' troubles, while being at most accessories, sunaition, to them, rather than their authors, aition, these being politicians of an earlier generation. Well, this evidence seems to me weak. Even on its face, Socrates is hardly passing absolution on Alcibiades. His remarks are double-edged. While imputing lesser responsibility to Alcibiades, they also anticipate a way in which people sometimes speak today of contemporary politicians as a symptom, not a cause, of their country's problems, where such terminology seeks the root cause of those problems further in the past, but without any intention of letting the current cohort off the hook. But Irwin also fails to consider the separation of author from character here. Socrates' interlocutor at this point is Callicles. Why, one might ask, is Socrates made at this point to refer to Alcibiades at all? A clue may come in Socrates speaking of him, it's part of T6, as my companion, tu emu hetairu. To the extent that Socrates' remarks reflect an opportunity in the dramatic context for him to make a qualified defense of Alcibiades against future slander, that is perhaps a natural thing for a friend to do. But Alcibiades is depicted as Socrates' companion, not Plato's. The authorial move of having Socrates refer to Alcibiades in this way reminds us that Socrates is not a neutral observer. It thus sows a seed of doubt about the impartiality of his even qualifiedly forgiving assessment. When it comes to Charmides now and his older cousin Critias, Socrates' two principal interlocutors in the Charmides, Irwin adopts a position that is the inverse of his treatment of Alcibiades. Accepting as plausible that Plato means at the end of the Charmides to allude to the future, within the drama, ignominious roles of the pair in the regime of the 30 tyrants, but denying that they are shown in the dialogue as closely associated with Socrates. Irwin thus writes, this isn't on the handout, but he writes that they, quote, cannot fairly be cited as examples of Socratic followers who turned out badly, close quote, given that, quote, the dialogue does not suggest that they took a very serious interest in Socrates, close quote. The trouble is that the dialogue manifestly shows them taking such an interest in the very same closing section. So this is T7 on the handout. Charmides professes that he is ready to be charmed by Socrates for as long as the latter deems fit, a stance that receives the wholehearted backing of Critias. It's hard to see what more Plato could have done to emphasize the pair's keenness for Charmides to follow Socrates for an indefinite period. What's remarkable is how a scholar as meticulous as Irwin can advocate a reading so clearly at odds with what we are given in the text. It's not really even a case of seeking evidence to fit a predetermined view. We've all been there. The evidence isn't there. It seems, on the contrary, given the way that Plato, with consummate dramatic art, interweaves a picture of the pair's future downfall with their professed devotion to Socrates, that we are encouraged to entertain the possibility of a critical stance on Plato's part towards his character Socrates regarding the latter's influence on his interlocutors. In interrogating the terms of the debate about Plato's relationship with his leading characters, I hope thereby to leave room for the idea of a Plato located at a critical distance from those characters, particularly Socrates. And to the extent that an author of intricately written works depicts a character who adopts a relentlessly oral practice, this in turn leaves room for a Plato who invites us to take seriously both the practice but also its apparent failures, and to consider whether, in terms of philosophical progress, engagement with a written work might have a greater chance of success. Now, there's certainly one obvious objection, I'm sure there are others as well, but certainly one obvious objection to this talk of failure, albeit one that applies at a different level from that of the Socratic encounters depicted within the dialogues. Socratic method seems, at least in one important way, to have been a huge success. Once it had the character and intellect of Plato to work on, it achieved results beyond what perhaps even Socrates might have imagined. Well, the historical Socrates inspired Plato, we can agree on that. So his method of engagement was in that respect a triumph. But what did Socrates inspire Plato to do? Among other things, compose a towering body of intricately constructed written works that return time and again to the figure of Socrates. Plato isn't a second Socrates, nor in any obvious way an inheritor, as opposed to a depictor, of Socrates' way of doing philosophy. The ultimate Platonic irony is how Socrates' orality serves as midwife of Plato's literary craft. Well, a certain dissatisfaction may be lingering at this point. Isn't there a strong sense, despite everything I've tried to say, that Socrates is the hero of the Platonic works, at least those in which he plays a leading role? Add to this that, as we've noted, Plato appears, albeit seldom, as a character within the works, identified as himself a supporter of Socrates. All that, it may then seem implausible to argue that the author Plato adopts a critical stance towards his character Socrates. I reply that this itself misses the point about the way Socrates is portrayed. Nothing in what I've said conflicts with the idea that Plato pays tribute to Socrates in these works. For surely the most appropriate tribute one might pay to a character depicted, as Socrates so often is, as relentlessly probing the ideas and practices of those he engages with, is to adopt such a stance oneself. From this perspective, what Plato on my reading does with his most prominent character is just what one should expect. Use Socrates' own example of critical questioning to critically question the carrying on of philosophy in a Socratic manner. given the way that the written and the oral are juxtaposed, both thematically, for example in the Phaedrus, and structurally, a series of written works depicting oral dialogue, it would be odd if Plato didn't expect his readers to think carefully and critically about how philosophy should be done in relation to the question of written versus oral. One possible upshot of such reflection is that Plato's choice to write and Socrates' devotion to orality as depicted in the writing represent two starkly different models for doing philosophy. Whatever the upshot of one's reflections, it is the written work that will have provided the stimulus. Well, this is an open-themed conference about the history of philosophy, so in belated and brief recognition of that, I want to just tentatively explore whether there may be some broader lessons to be drawn from the Platonic case. And here I pick up again on what seems to me the most striking feature about the mouthpiece view. Not that everybody holds it, they don't, but that it persists to this day as a common enough approach to interpreting Plato, and with it the idea that it's fine if one wishes to just get on and to all intents and purposes identify Plato with his leading character in a way that would not be tenable in virtually any other case of interpreting a written work that features a leading character distinct from its author. Why is this acceptable in the Platonic case? I've offered a few thoughts above on this relating to some strands in the recent history of Platonic scholarship. But let me now make a slightly less parochial suggestion. We have as a kind of standard model of a philosophical text, influenced of course by contemporary professional practice, one in which the author's unmediated view is there in front of us for interpreting. Now, of course, in the wider historical canon, there are storied exceptions to this model. Nietzsche and Kierkegaard come immediately to mind as cases where and there are some ancient authors as well, one could say this about, but in the post-ancient period, Nietzsche and Kierkegaard certainly come to mind as cases where any worthwhile interpretation of their thought will be intricately connected to questions about how their works are written, including the authorial indirectness with which they are written. Still, it seems to me that such figures remain, from the perspective that I'm discussing, marginal. The standard model that consciously or unconsciously we bring to philosophical texts is that of the author delivering their views straight to the reader. So however difficult or obscure those views may be, the particular barrier to interpretation thrown up by it being, so to speak, structurally unclear what views expressed in a work can properly be attributed to its author is, on this paradigm, absent. And what happens, because of the dominance of the paradigm, is that it is then treated as legitimately applied, even in cases, such as that of Plato, where it really doesn't fit. Yet, as I have suggested, the assimilation of Plato to such an ill-fitting model means we are in danger of not really interpreting Plato at all. Finally, then, and with awareness of the irony, let me use the Platonic case to offer a generalization of my own that I hope will not seem too glib or specious. For all the rightful and essential talk these days about the need for diversity in philosophy, it seems to me that one case of diversity too often remains close to taboo in our considerations about how to do philosophy and how to read its history. The diversity of how philosophical works have been, and therefore can be, written. 2.5 millennia on from when he wrote his astonishing works, I like to think that in this, as in other ways, Plato still has something to teach us. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, we have a good 45 minutes for questions. I think our
might just sit at this point.
Yeah, good idea. I think our Q&A is going to be recorded, and so would it be all right if I could ask you to sort of recap the gist of the question as responding? In case it's not
or
picked
one
up,
of us can do
yes.
that. Yeah, absolutely.
Yep. I don't want to ask you to do too much. Okay, so if you wouldn't mind being loud and concise for your fellow attendees, and I'll try and get through as many questions as I can. If you could leave your hands up, please, that would be great. I'm going to start at the back for now. I see mostly on the right-hand side. Yes. Could you rest of you leave your hands up, please, guys? Yes, go ahead, Arthur.
Thanks for the talk. This question surprisingly.
But sorry, I'll bit like my ancient ears. Speak up a bit if you can.
Thanks for the talk. This question, very surprisingly, is going to be about laws.
Ta-da!
I guess. So I take your point that we're not, I guess, entitled to we're not entitled to have a deep position that any character in the dialogue is a mouthpiece of Plato's views. I guess what do you think about, I guess this idea might be contested, but at least as I read the laws, that many ideas which are articulated in some form in the Republic are almost, maybe, I'm not really sure how to put it, regurgitated might be one way of putting it. For example, with local laws, where there's a structured surrender that kind of a city which doesn't look to, I guess, for common good, but only looks to the interests of certain parties, like a faction management or something like that. But in black text, it's a different primary interlocutor who's articulating the same thing. So I guess the question is, if we see different primary interlocutors or protagonists articulating a similar view, which might a view which it's easy to kind of read as a kind of Platonism, how do we deal with that?
Yep, good. And I'm going to give a fairly sort of ironic answer to that, which I think I'm sort of fine with that. I think once the opponent, in the terms that I've said out the dialectic, once the opponent starts giving reasons why we might want to identify a set of views as Plato's, that's okay, and then we can debate those reasons, and then we're up and running, and then we're up in the business of substantive, interpretive sort of moves back and forth. That's all right, and it is indeed, as you will know, Arthur, a very common move that they make. But I mean, often it goes something like this, right? At the beginning of some article or book, say, well, when we see the same views articulated by different characters, that's good reason for da-da-da, and fine, and then we can start debating that principle. The one slightly less ironic thing I'd say to that is that, I'm sure this doesn't apply to you, Arthur, but often the proponents of that kind of principle are pretty lax about their criterion for what an identity of view is. And I think that's not just a sort of sophistic philosopher's reply. I think that it goes to the heart of, again, how the works are written, right? For example, very different context in the laws from Republic. You've got to think about all of that first. Think about all of that. Think about why these characters might be putting forth these views there, and why a different bunch of characters might be putting forth their views. Think about that. Think about what identity of view means. Doing that, again, if they do all that, I couldn't be happier, because then they're taking seriously the structure of the Platonic works. But I would, certainly in this particular it's a very familiar case, as you know, I tend to push back on the way this is actually done, which tends to be very quick. And, oh yeah, identity of view, tick, 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 we know what those are, and those are Plato's views. And that I think is too quick. But the principle of giving reasons for why you might think there are mouthpieces, that's okay. Yes.
Hi, thank you very much. So, let's say the characters are Plato's mouthpiece. Do we think that the characters are themselves? Like, is Socrates expressing Socrates' view?
I'm going to be, having been ironic with Arthur, I'm going to be a bit evasive with you and say, I mean, this is a notorious problem. We don't know, and I mean, I just very briefly, my view about the so-called Socratic problem, which is, if only if only Socrates was the only, if only Plato's Socrates was the only Socrates we had, at least we might possibly delude ourselves, but at least okay, that's something like the historical figure. We have Xenophon and his Socrates seem so different. We have Aristophanes, okay, a comic poet, but probably the closest, the chronologically the closest person to Socrates. So can't just dismiss that. And so there's this utter confusion about who on earth was this historical guy. For what it's worth, I tend to think that it's actually perhaps slightly leaving Aristophanes and his motives to one side, I think it's possibly no surprise that somebody who was seemingly as open to talking to all sorts of people as Socrates might have made very different impressions, and indeed conducted himself in very different ways when faced with, say, a Xenophon or a Plato. So, okay, but that, in a way, that wasn't really your question. Your question was, well, if it's not Plato and it's not this god of Socrates, who the hell is it? Well, again, rather boringly, I want to say it's a character. And of course, it's a character who had a historical counterpart. And of course, there's always, I'm doing this, of course, I'm smuggling in probably in effect, certain assumptions about the historical character, such as, although this seems pretty uncontroversial, such as his devotion to oral practice of philosophy. And I think from my point of view, that's, as will have perhaps been obvious from the talk, at the moment at least, that's my sort of biggest fault line when I'm thinking about what Socrates is doing with this character, and he's thinking through the idea of the oral practice of philosophy versus writing philosophy. And I think there one perhaps doesn't have to be worry too much about the relation to the historical counterpart. It's a character, there's some relation there. We're supposed to think of, I think one thing to say is, again, this has to be very speculative, but I think Plato would have perhaps had some aspirations for his work outliving by many, as it's turned out, many centuries or millennia, any historical memory of Socrates. And again, ironically, once one takes the idea that these are written works seriously, you've got an author and some characters, and that's what we're dealing with. Is that, yeah.
Professor, I'm totally convinced that you can't identify Plato with any one of his characters, even Socrates. But what would you say to the question of if you can separate him from any one of his characters, it's difficult in the same sense to separate him from his choice, from the corpus as a whole, meaning from his choice to write dialogues, each one which is a partial discussion of a certain problem with certain types of people, and then all of those taken together. I just wanted to ask if you wildly speculate what is Plato trying to do with this corpus?
There's a question. Yeah. I think honestly, I think it's a really difficult question to answer. And if I'm really honest about myself, what I think of myself as doing in thinking about this stuff is like, this is the first, and obviously I've done some interpreting Plato over the years, but in terms of like the global purpose, I think what the kind of thing I've been trying to do today is to like give us the very first step of what that would look like, right? So you've got to start by, there's so much complexity in Plato. And again, this might seem a little bit sort of sophisticated. It's really not meant to be, but the idea that we have this ultimately very simple and common feature, which is author separated from characters, and that has to be the kind of essential first step in building a view about what Plato is up to globally. One of the obvious complications, and you kind of alluded to it in your question, is we have a bunch of different works with different characters, different contexts, different ideas. Huge question about what the relation to those ideas is and how it fits into some whole. My own, for what it's worth, I think one thing one has to do here is be led by the little bits of kind of solidity that we have. So one of them is separation, just a basic structure for each of the works. Another is the fact that some of the works seem to be written as sort of sequels to one another. So there's a whole series of works in and around Socrates' trial. That's another basic datum. So there'd be no surprise there if perhaps we're supposed to see. So in fact, Plato being such a good writer, it'd be disappointing if one couldn't at the end of the day find some kind of unity or coherence to those works that we are told are sort of were presented as being written as in some cases actually continuous conversations, like Sophos Politicus, some cases chronologically continuous, apology, Euthyphro, apology, Plato, Phaedo. What's interesting again is that interpreters don't generally use that as a criterion. So people say, oh well, the Phaedo's middle period and the Euthyphro is early period. Hang on, A, we have no idea when Plato, absolutely no idea when Plato writes. So, B, they're written as a chronological sequence. So stick to the. Makes me sound like a modern manager. Stick to the data. Outside of that, my own view, and again here, at least I think I'm being true to the way the dialogues are written. I tend to treat the individual dialogue as the primary unit of interpretation. I'm not too worried, other than where we're being given a sort of fairly indicative clue by the author of how they necessarily put together.
Thank you. I really like the suggestion that Plato is sort of continually trying to critically engage with this method. And I just wondered how, it's not a dialogue, but how this might factor into the letter, because there are almost... Yeah, he's flipping it, so he's almost engaging in this old tradition himself by going to Syracuse. And yet, obviously when he isn't writing the seventh letter, depending on the authenticity, he also critiques writing philosophy. He also has the digression there. So I just wondered whether you thought of, even outside of the dialogue, to the letter in this view, or...
Yeah, again, this is probably going to be a bit of a boring answer. It's a nice question. So you're absolutely right. There is a piece of evidence that Plato has views about writing that don't seem to be dissimilar to views expressed by Socrates in the Phaedrus. That would be Plato's views if the letter were authentic. And I'm not going to make this about, because it would be a pretty arbitrary bit of speculation. I don't know whether the letter's authentic or not. There seems to be. It's funny how things come and go. I think the first Alcibiades, when I was starting out, most people thought that wasn't authentic. I still don't think it's authentic. I think a majority of scholars now do. It's been a really great work, and sometimes it's like, no, but it doesn't feel like Plato, which is no argument at all. And for what it's worth, the seventh letter doesn't feel like Plato to me, but that's no argument. I think in terms of the text of the seventh, and so of course that I think we agree on this, right? That if it's by Plato, it's Plato's views, right? It's a letter. There's no character, so I think that one would have to say that. I think so. The boring answer is, I think the text of the seventh letter is actually very careful, which would be huge tribute to its author if it wasn't Plato. I think it talks. I think its vocabulary. We'd have to look at this in more detail, but I think the vocabulary is suggestive of specifically writing about treatises rather than about dialogues. So I think there's kind of a get-up towards the seventh letter. But you're right to draw our attention to it, and I think it's interesting that I think Socrates' criticism in the Phaedrus looks more comprehensive. I think it's slightly narrower in the seventh letter, but we'd have to look at the text. Thanks. Nice to meet you.
Thank you. Next we have Yoki.
Yeah, hey,
hi. All right. The gods. Appropriate.
Question about the ancient practice of reading Plato. So I know now people have treatises, and that's why there's the sort of default is that we have where there should be something like a doctrine to extract and interpret. But it seems to me that this is an old thing. Aristotle writes about Plato in a way that as if he's reading off things from Plato's dialogue. In the Ethics, he cites them in this way. as Plato says here, or as Plato says in the Timaeus, he makes the soul out of elements. And it's, it's weird, so I think there is a bit of, there's some pedigree to this kind of interpretive mode, and I think, so I just wonder whether, what you would say to that, and also that the ancient Platonists also thought that, look, this dialogue is about that, that's the doctrine, and we can sort of work it out then with what the speakers are. That is our beloved Plato.
Yeah. So it's a great question, and of course, yes. I mean, Aristotle, who I tend to sort of marginalise when I'm thinking about this kind of stuff, he's Exhibit A, isn't he, for the view that here we have a contemporary who pretty much, I mean, of course, there's the usual sort of complications, but pretty much seems to think you could read off Plato's views from what the leading character says. And again, this is going to perhaps sound like a slightly limp response, but I tend to think that's just because Aristotle is doing philosophy, not history of philosophy. He's interested in ideas, and I think I'd say the same about, I mean, the Platonists are a more interesting case because, of course, the Platonists think they're being Platonists. I don't think Plato was a Platonist, but that's neither here nor there. Certainly in Aristotle's case, I just think he's interested in ideas, and I think he doesn't, and all credit to him. I mean, we do this weird thing called history of philosophy, where we're interested in interpreting texts in, I think, ways which don't necessarily, I mean, I wouldn't ever want to claim that interpreting Plato necessarily yields better philosophical results. I mean, I'm actually perhaps weirdly quite extreme about this. I really think there's a thing called interpreting an author, and it may or may not be the best way philosophically to get to make progress. And I suspect that's what Aristotle was thought too. That I mean, there are, again, without getting into the complications, sometimes he does seem to refer to the historical Socrates and something. So there's some sensitivity there to the way the dialogues are written. But I think his sort of overall interest is Aristotle. He wants to make philosophical progress. And here's this amazing treasury of ideas called the Platonic corpus, and he's going to work with that. And we have, for better or worse, a different way of thinking about philosophical texts that aren't necessarily entirely about philosophical ideas and how we develop them and how we make philosophical progress ourselves. I think the Platonists are trickier because they're very, very good and careful readers of Plato. But that's the current thought.
Yes, with the Green Church. Actually, I wanted to go back to the Socratic problem because one way we can look at this, like when we interpret so that none of the characters in dialogues are actually like how we play. So it also sets an interesting contrast between the characters in the dialogues and the historical version. So, for example, so in this case we have Plato Socrates in the dialogue, who Plato writes to have certain views which are not necessarily his own views, and then there's the historical Socrates who has, of course, his own Socratic views which we might not know very much about. But there's an interesting contrast between these three things, and that also might be, if we are reading the Plato in this way, a deliberate thing that he's trying to accomplish. So I just thought if you have something to say about this Socratic problem in this view.
To clarify a little bit, so
so there is kind of like there's a difference between what Socrates says in the plays, what Plato thinks, and what Socrates himself thought.
Yes, indeed. Yes.
So and there's this kind of a big interesting dialogue between these three views, and of course something which we cannot. There is all of this very indirect.
And again, it's as you hinted, it is difficult to be anything other than agnostic about this. I mean, it is fascinating that Plato chooses, for the most part, I mean, we're not sure if, say, Callicles was a real person, but for the most part, these were known historical figures. And I suppose, if anything, the idea that he's choosing known historical figures, I mean, perhaps prima facie, ought to make it even less likely that these are mouthpieces. But I think it's so, because we know, in at least a lot of the more interesting historical characters, we know so little about them outside of either outside of what Plato gives us, or what we do know makes it very hard to actually then arrive at a clear sense of what the historical characters thought. That it's just hard to go there. And as I say, I think given Socrates, by general consensus is that Plato didn't even start writing until after Socrates was executed, and then the historical memory is already fading, and then we have an author and characters. And I think I'd love to say more about, but I don't know what more there is to say.
I'm going to go back up to yes, thank you.
Hi, Raphael, thank you for that. So, yes, the principle of separation, a much better formulation than taking the dialogue form seriously. What does that even mean? So thank you for that. That's really helpful. Now, I agree with you, but I also think it's incredibly difficult to get started doing any kind of interpretive work without some axioms of some sort. I said axioms, but that's probably not the right word.
Yeah. No,
We need
sure.
some anchors.
Yeah.
We need some anchors. And here are some of mine. Possibly you share some of them, possibly you don't. Plato thought that Socrates was good in a way that Athenian conventional morality and ways of talking and thinking didn't obviously leave room for. That it was a crime or a wrong to execute Socrates. That Socrates' goodness is somehow deeply, intrinsically related to the kinds of things Socrates said. Possibly also to the way he said them, but okay, so take that.
Yeah.
Now, you may or may not share some of these, but it would be very hard, I think, to interpret any dialogues at all, even individually, without some kind of orientation about the stance of the author towards the characters that he's presenting. If I think that these are my axioms, though, and this is where it's a kind of suggestion, it's not, I don't think that Plato thinks these things about Socrates because he depicts Socrates alive, or and therefore or because he gives Socrates a prominent role, or anything as crude as that. It's going to be for literary reasons, for reasons that a literature scholar looking at Sense and Sensibility is going to say, Jane Austen is making this critique of contemporary novels and their audience through the depiction of Marianne and Eleanor. And that Marianne is depicted in a certain way that provides the critique. Things like that. Or George Eliot has a view about the work or otherwise of scholarship and how it gets connected to truth and how that can be lived out in different ways. And you see that in her characterization of Dorothea, of whom she is in favor and sympathetic, and Cosselon, of whom she is critical. Right? And that's a view, we would say that George Eliot is critical of Cosselon. I assume, I take it, but this is, I guess if there's a question, there's a question. You're perfectly happy with people making those kinds of views about Plato's relationship to Socrates and so on. But we have to make the case in literary terms, and people mostly don't do that.
That's pretty much it. I mean, I suppose in terms of my own view, I think because partly I'm seeing myself as pushing back against the idea that, as it were, has, also Plato-Socrates identity running with Socrates is the hero who's good and all of that, that I then perhaps, tend to go looking for, given that I'm pushing hard the idea of taking separation seriously. I think this may be just because, it's a fair question that I've also been asked, is sort of, what's the big deal, right? What are you really after in sort of first order terms? And I think it would have to be something like, in a way, for it to be, it might still be a correct view, but for it to be an interesting view. Lots of interesting views that aren't correct and lots of correct views that aren't interesting in philosophy. But it would have to be something like, no, he's a lot more critical of Socrates than we might have thought. And I suppose my sort of toy picture of all this would be something like, here's a guy, and okay, now as one has to, in a sense, now invoking the mythical historical Socrates, here's a guy who turned Plato's world upside down, who made Plato aware that there was a radically different way of looking at almost every aspect of what was traditional Greek ways of doing things, and spending nearly a whole lifetime kind of engaging with that, but engaging with it in a way that recognized the danger of the method, the danger of some of the content, and then we start doing our first order approach. So probably I'm slightly, if there's good and evil axis, I'm probably slightly more towards the evil axis than you are. But I think that's very much a matter of first order differences. And where we seem to agree is that, as long as this arises out of a respect for the basic structure of the works, it's all good. Not really, but for present purposes, it's all good. If that helps. Yeah.
Yes, thank you, John. Yes, so we've touched on this to some degree in your questions, but I guess I'll ask it more directly. Are there any consistent hermeneutical keys that we can use?
Sorry, are there any
consistent hermeneutical keys that we can kind of use to get at Plato's views, or are we left with a kind of more or less complete agnosticism about what he thought, given the separation of author?
I suppose I see. It depends on what one takes a hermeneutical key to be. For me, the two basic starting points are separation, and then, as I said to the gentleman who asked the earlier question, certain dialogues certainly seem to be written to be read in the light of one another, in terms of either being continuous conversations or having some chronological continuity. Beyond that, no, I think we look and see what's written. The one other thing I'd add, and maybe this is already, perhaps if those first two things weren't were prior to hermeneutics, perhaps this one will be post, as it were. But I do think, and again, I genuinely find sort of astonishing. There's really very little on the stuff about the written versus the oral in Plato. And for me, that is the most. The Phaedrus being sort of Exhibit A, of course, but that is, to me, that's the most striking phenomenon that again seems to be basic to these dialogues, that you have these amazing written works featuring a guy who's constantly telling us how, either in depiction or often enough in what Socrates himself says, championing the oral. And, that's some kind of clue or key, I take it. And I think those three things, I think at that point I want to say any interpretation that respects that is fine by me, but it has to respect those three things. You may have been thinking of other, I don't always, the word hermeneutics doesn't always register with me as something where I can sort of have a good sense of what's being talked about. But would that fit the kind of landscape?
I'm thinking one other key might be praise and blame as assigned to different characters.
Right.
Kind of related to the question that was asked a moment ago. I think to me that seems kind of reliable as a way of figuring out what his views were to some degree, although it would be harder to apply that to speculative claims like the ideas.
So who's
who receives praise and who receives...
No, I get that, but are you thinking of any specific...
Well, I mean, just the idea of virtue is something praiseworthy, the sophist is something blameworthy.
Right.
Lack of virtue is something blameworthy.
Yes.
I think there's a theory of virtue
Yes.
that you can get out of the Republic that's probably more or less identical to Plato's, based on how he's praising it.
There we get into. Just very on one sense of the Republic, I tend to think that the Republic is very much Socrates' vision, and Plato's being critically distanced from that vision. I mean, there's a lot of stuff there's a fair amount of stuff in the Republic about, how hard done by we philosophers are in current Athenian society, and wouldn't it be so much better? So I think Plato certainly may be thinking there of what a good society for Socrates would look like. And then to me it's just a further question, what we think Plato's take on what he's depicting is. Yes.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting. Well, I must say that during your lecture, every time you played something, I thought in my mind about, yes, but what about that? And then you answered.
All right.
You answered, and I said, oh, okay, that's good. And so, yeah, so your lecture was very interesting and very, answering many questions that I didn't think of. But I'm still,
good.
There is one question that I do want to, you mentioned the apology. You said that this is the only dialogue that Plato put himself in, okay? But again, it's like it doesn't take part. I mean, it's not like he's saying anything, it's just present.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, now put that aside, and having said all the things you said, from my experience of reading the dialogues, there are a lot of, first of all, regarding the characters. So, in addition to Socrates, we have the leading characters, and we have the side characters. So, what about them? I mean, what are their roles?
Yeah.
That first. And second, many dialogues, you have some kind of regressions or kind of a side story. Oh, I remember that. Oh, someone told me that. And for me, as a researcher, this is exactly those little hints that I can try to uncover some of the question you raised. So I think that the details are important. We should. So my question is, how would you explain Plato's presence in Socrates' trial? And maybe go back to your assumptions. And I know that Socrates was an historical character. He was, but they did share, Plato did share Socrates' ideas. But he did know that if he will put them straightforward, he might get with conflict like Socrates did, and paid with in his life with it, with his life. So maybe at the end of the day, yes, maybe Plato is hiding behind Socrates. But this is a side question. I'm more interested to hear what you think Plato is doing there. Why he put himself there? Because it doesn't have any. It doesn't affect the narrative of the dialogue, and on the apology in no such way.
That's right. And it's a piece of. This is classic Plato, isn't it? That even when he makes himself more present there than anywhere else in the corpus, it's elusive, isn't it? He doesn't. It's hard to figure out. I think the one thing. This is where, of course, and then it depends what you do with this. But I wouldn't wish to deny that, from a dramatic point of view, he's presenting himself as a supporter of Socrates. And then 64,000 scholars is, what does it mean to be a supporter of Socrates? And you can take, these are sort of slight caricatures, but you can say, well, it means that he was an uncritical devotee of what came out of Socrates' mouth. Or you can say, no, he was absolutely bowled over by this guy who went around subverting every conventional view. And what does it mean? I'll turn my answer into a question. What does it mean to be a supporter of somebody who does that? I find it implausible. I mean, this isn't an argument, but it's a response. I find it implausible that somebody who presents themselves as a supporter of somebody who is presented as being this radically subversive figure, and I think there's no question that that's how he's presented, would be, oh yeah, so this guy has then got it all right, and we now know what virtue is, and we know how to live a good life, and da da da. I find that deeply implausible. So so I think Plato puts himself there to ask the question, what does it mean to be a supporter of Socrates? And then it's over to us as readers to respond.
And if we do think, if we do accept the assumption that he was a supporter, then maybe we can also think what stuff he took from Socrates,
Yes.
and what things
Oh,
he
absolutely.
did not.
Yes.
And by inside the dialogues.
Yes. Yeah,
That's
and
a-
I'm open to that. I mean, again, I sometimes, I mean, because of the dialectic of this, because of the view that I take myself, sometimes it's going to sound like I'm saying, well, he didn't believe in anything. No, that's about first order interpretation. But I think there are some. I mean, going back to the question about hermeneutics, I think, you know, as I'm thinking aloud in response to these brilliant questions, I mean, there are stances I have in terms of what would be plausible and implausible.
Yeah.
For example, about what it means to be a supporter of somebody who's depicted as Socrates.
Okay, we have a few questions and not many minutes. It's nice if the audience hears as many different questions as possible, I think, and they get picked up later on in the conference. So if we could perhaps just try and have some more concise raising and answering, we could just get through a fair pack of them before coffee. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much for your talk. This is the question sort of you actually have a question raised upstairs. I don't know the name, but Amber. So one of your points about the critical distance between Plato and Socrates is that Plato presents Socrates talking to a lot of these objectionable interlocutors that the audience knows will turn out to be like Alcibiades, people that will be scorned by the audience. But it seems clear that Plato wants to explore how come this admirable philosopher had so many students, let's say, that became duds. But then he has Socrates come up with a bunch of explanations, right? In the Republic, there's the stuff about the person that has a philosophical soul is at most danger of becoming a tyrant. In the Phaedrus, there's like the souls that have seen the least forms who become sophists, so there's nothing really you can do. And the effect of these explanations is exculpatory, right?
Absolutely.
There's nothing Socrates could have done really to have changed the destiny of these people. So even though there's some criticism being baked in, this is mainly like a defense of Socrates. So I guess my question is, perhaps a better perspective wouldn't be to ask whether Socrates is Plato's mouthpiece. Maybe this is looking at it from the wrong perspective. Maybe Plato is Socrates' apologist. That maybe does a better job of explaining the obvious sympathy that Plato has for Socrates' perspective without our having to think about whether they share exactly the same ideas. So I wonder.
And I don't think that's unreasonable. I mean, I think yes, there's lots of self-exculpation. I mean, it's Socrates' own self-exculpation, so it raises the question of what our take is supposed to be on that. And you know, and some scholars have actually, I mean, Berniak famously about the impiety of Socrates says no, basically this is, you know, no wonder they executed him. And it's interesting if one of Plato's purposes was to persuade us that the Athenian jury did what they were supposed to do. I would say that. I mean, it's funny because I'm writing a paper right now on Socratic self-exculpation, so this is very much sort of churning around in my mind. I mean, I think what's interesting is that a lot of the self-exculpation looks like the kind of thing you might say, well, Socrates would say that, wouldn't he? In other words, it looks like there's plenty of room being left open for that not being a conclusive picture of what one might say about Socratic practice. I mean, there's one extraordinary, just very, very quickly to mention, one extraordinary passage in Republic Book 7, where Socrates says that if you expose people to dialectic before the age of 30, they're going to turn out terribly. And he doesn't name himself. It sounds like he's talking about himself. So there's a lot, I throw that in there, there's a lot to reckon with when one's talking about. And again, I'm not, obviously, as you do, I'm slightly resisting the idea that there's, I like the difference between mouthpiece and apologist. I think they're not the same thing. I slightly resist the idea that in a kind of straightforward, uncritical way, he's even Socrates' apologist.
Yes.
Thank you for this fascinating topic that you're addressing and bring us into the conversation. I find myself brainstorming on the differences between a typical narrative where characters also engage in actions and are part of a plot, and so they're characterized through multiple features of the narrative. Where in Plato we have dialogue, so it's like a component of a narrative without the context. And then in this dialogue, the focus is on usually argument, logic, reasoning, and sometimes myth to express as vehicles of expressing truth. So in light of how I understand Plato's overall program of highlighting the reason as the ultimate determinant of truth, because it's connected to the nous, right, the cosmic nous. I'm wondering perhaps the connection with the characters doesn't matter as much as the argument itself, that he expects that the argumentation and the argument will resonate through the universal reason with the reader, so that the character is really just a vehicle, and it doesn't matter whether it's protagonist or antagonist, or as long as the dialectic is being played out and the argument is kind of made clear, so that the strength goes from, the authority goes from the person, which is where also he's hiding himself, to the argument itself, to the reason.
Well, you can say that, and I think that often, again, this is an interesting case where often Socrates seems to put forward that kind of view. It's the logos that matters, not me or you. I mean, the trouble with that view is that that's embedded in a written work which has loads of characters in it. So, again, for me, that would be a datum of interpretation of Plato. And I mean, it's a really nice question, because there's a juxtaposition that I hadn't really been focusing on, but the difference between MM has done some marvelous stuff on this. One of her famous questions is why there's so many people in Plato. And it's a really good and difficult question. But I would say the way you put it, it raises very nicely one of these kind of fault lines where what Socrates the character sets, where it's not about him, it's about the logos, and the way the works are structured, which is they always have loads of characters, not always clear what they're all doing there. Sometimes you get these lists of characters' names, like, okay, all right, like something's really, I'm not quite sure what, but something's really being hammered home to us by the author. So again, I think I'd accept what you said about the figure of Socrates, but I think we have to respect the datum that these are works with lots of characters, and our interpretation has to do something with that.
I'm afraid I have about 5 questions that we're not going to get to, but hopefully you'll have a chance to talk to these people over the next couple of days. Before we thank Raphael, I just want we have our refreshments delivered, contrary to my expectation, quite expertly. But the chairs of the sessions, we have half an hour. The chairs of the sessions that will be happening at 3 o'clock. Please do remember that you are leading it at 3 o'clock and ending it at 5 o'clock. And then at that point, we'll be gathering at the River Terrace Cafe for a small wine reception in the sunshine and the fresh air. Okay, with that in mind, let's just thank Raphael for
Thank you, Roy.